Thank you, everybody, for attending to today's webinar, Using Agile on IT Infrastructure Projects. This is one in a series of webinars that we run roughly every 2 weeks throughout the year to bring you topics of interest in many different areas related to project management, leadership, and organizational change management. I'm Kevin Aguanno. I'm going to be your host for today. I've got over 30 years of experience in project management and Agile and related topics. I spent a lot of my career at IBM working on a wide range of projects. We spent quite a number of years working on software development, systems integration projects, and many of these included significant infrastructure components. I've built data centers, very extensive telephony and similar solutions. So I've got a lot of examples I can draw from as we go through the examples for today. Okay, we've got a few more people joining in. Excellent. And Iqbal can't hear. Iqbal, you need to choose an audio option from the audio tab on the web interface. The instructions in your email. All right, hopefully that'll resolve the connection problems. We have a few more people just joined in as well. Welcome. Okay, so we're going to proceed. So I've got a long background in IT, as I said, infrastructure, software development, systems integration projects with IBM and with other companies, both before and after my time at IBM. And I've learned quite a bit about Agile and how Agile can apply in these environments. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, moving forward. Specifically, first, I'm going to talk about how Agile is not just being used for software development projects. Agile is much more applicable. Many people think Agile is just about software, and that's not true at all. So we're going to be talking about that. Specifically, we're going to talk about when does Agile make sense? What kinds of projects, under what circumstances does it make sense to use Agile? And guess what? You can tell from the title of this presentation that some of those will be IT infrastructure projects. Not every IT infrastructure project, but some of them. It will make sense to use Agile for these types of projects. I'm going to deal with specific IT infrastructure project challenges, and we'll give you some specific scenarios and how Agile may apply in those situations to get you out of trouble for those specific problems. And I'm going to talk about certain Agile techniques that might be applicable on any IT infrastructure project. Whether it's ideally suited to Agile or not, there may be some things that we can do from Agile that may help boost the project, make it a little bit more efficient. And we'll talk about some key takeaways from this project as well, or this presentation as well. So first off, I want to talk about how Agile is not just for software development like many people think. In fact, Agile has its early roots in manufacturing, product development, and industrial manufacturing, and in aerospace and defense industries in R&D. So Agile comes from a non-software environment. It's just that many of those techniques as they evolved through the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s, those were in those non-software environments. But as we got into the 80s and 90s, many of these techniques were inspirations for the software development industry, where people had specific challenges that these emerging, what eventually we called them Agile, these emerging Agile techniques were very applicable in those software environments. So while it started in automotive and industrial manufacturing and in other aerospace and defense industries, eventually these techniques got adopted by the software development industry, who further refined them and changed them and popularized them. So we often hear about Agile as if it started in the software development industry, but that's where these techniques got their widest adoption, their widest rollout across the world. And also that was the group of people that eventually labeled these things Agile. Before that, they were called something else. Largely, they were classified as the lightweight IID methods. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, the lightweight IID methods. But these methods had been around throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and onwards. So it was just in software that it became popularized, right? But they're used definitely outside of the software world. They always have been, and indeed still are today. In fact, if you look at this graph, this was taken from a 2013 survey, you'll see that the demand for using Agile is the largest in the IT industry. But look at some of those other industries. There's some significant representation in other areas. And in fact, in a study I did just a year later, we saw that the largest growth in Agile, cumulative annual growth, the largest growth in annual, the compound growth, is actually outside of IT altogether, right? IT projects certainly are growing and they're the largest use of Agile, but look at the dark areas on this graph. They're growing faster, right? They're becoming a larger portion of the use of Agile techniques, and this is happening largely in the fastest growth outside of IT altogether. So Agile is very applicable in non-IT projects, never mind non-software projects within IT. And if we look at these non-IT projects, product development makes sense. That's kind of where many of these Agile techniques grab their roots. But there's other areas that might catch you by surprise. Marketing campaigns, business process change, mergers and acquisitions, where two companies are blending their processes and people together. Projects where you're expecting this, even construction, right? But projects where you're expecting to see high levels of change and uncertainty is where these Agile projects really shine. And we certainly have those projects outside of IT, but what about inside IT as well? Well, let's just take a look at that. PMI, the Project Management Institute, this is the standards, one of the standards bodies for project management profession. PMI says that now all project managers must know Agile. And this is a fairly recent change. They've been evolving, adopting more Agile practices over the years, talking a little bit more about Agile. The PMBOK guide version 5 finally mentioned Agile. Version 6 actually had some Agile stuff sprinkled throughout it. And now with version 7, it's a dramatic change. As of January 1st of this year, 2021, Agile questions, Agile and hybrid Agile questions make up 50% of the questions on the PMP exam. So this is the certification exam for project managers. 50% of the questions are Agile. It doesn't matter what industry you come from, PMI expects you to know Agile if you're a PM. That's a significant change. Agile's not just some software development thing, even construction PMs, people building, bridges and roads, people doing industrial projects, everybody needs to know these Agile tools and techniques because they're often applicable on many types of projects, regardless of industry. PMI also changed the rules around trainers of the PMP exam prep course. PMI now authorizes trainers to teach the course, and authorized trainers need Agile experience before PMI will even accept their application. So they want people who know Agile to be teaching these PMP exam prep courses. The PMBOK guide, as I said, has been now not just Agile's even more present in it, they've completely rewritten it from the ground up. This is a complete rewriting of the PMBOK guide, completely restructured from the ground up to incorporate Agile thinking, Agile philosophy, Agile practices all the way through it. For example, it now has principles. They've created these concepts of principles, right? And some of them include adaptability and resiliency. How do we respond to change and adapt to change? How to deal with complexity and complex situations that may lead to uncertainty and fuzziness on a project. Systems thinking, some of the other Agile approaches, even a focus on delivering value to the business being one of the most important things, not being on time, on budget, on scope, but have we delivered value to the business and maximize that value delivery? So very much Agile philosophy items are working their way fundamentally into how PMI is thinking about project management. So not only do they have principles, they've also identified performance domains. They've gotten rid of the knowledge areas. They've gotten rid of many of the other concepts, right? The process groups, these are gone from the PMBOK guide, and instead they've replaced them with principles and performance domains. And the performance domains include things like how to choose the right approach or life cycle. Don't just always use waterfall. Sometimes it's waterfall, sometimes it's agile, sometimes it's something else, right? Or a hybrid approach. So how to make those decisions, that's now part of the performance domains that are expected of PMs in version 7 of the PMBOK guide. Also, how to deal with uncertainty. What they're trying to do is prepare people for something the US military for years has called VUCA, V-U-C-A, situations that are volatile, uncertain, changing, and ambiguous. VUCA. And that's the real world we're seeing these days with all the fast pace of change in our business environment, with globalization and the pressures therefrom, with technological advancements and how it's changing the world, right? New competitive pressures. So much is changing in this world. Climate change is driving interesting changes in many areas. With all this change happening, people realize that some traditional project management practices just don't make sense anymore. And Agile is very applicable in these situations to help these projects adapt to the change. So even PMI says that all project managers need to know Agile. So when does Agile actually make sense on a project? What kinds of projects should we even think about applying Agile? Well, one of the things that we know is different kinds of projects face different kinds of challenges. Some projects execute in a world that's very stable and certain, and other projects execute in environments characterized by change and ambiguity and uncertainty, these VUCA situations. We need to be able to respond to both. I'm going to tell you 2 different examples. Sometimes projects are very certain and stable, and they're operating in a very certain and stable environment. We like to describe those as shooting a bullet from a rifle at a target, right? These projects are characterized by enormous amounts of time estimating gathering requirements and doing design. And what we're really trying to do there is clarify what is the target of the project. We're trying to see the target. And the more time we spend gathering requirements and doing design, the clearer we can see the target until we can see the bullseye. Once you can see the bullseye, you know you've got a very good, clear understanding of the goals of the project. And then once we understand the goals, now we got to build a plan to get there. So we have enormous amounts of time estimating and planning, right? Trying to aim so we can find an aim that points right at the bullseye. This is like aiming the bullet at the target. The more time we spend aiming, the more accurate, hopefully, our aim gets until we're pointing right at the bullseye and we have what we call the perfect plan. Once you've got what is theoretically a perfect plan, you pull the trigger, the bullet leaves the rifle, and it's just going to follow that plan until it hits the bullseye and you succeed. That's a defined process model, right? That's like shooting a bullet from a rifle. And those projects exist. There's lots of projects where the requirements are stable and well understood. The business stakeholders know exactly what they want. Maybe we've done this similar project, dozens and dozens of times. So we know what we're doing. There's not a lot of uncertainty. We're not expecting a lot of change. Then this process is very efficient. This is also known as the waterfall process, the waterfall technique, the waterfall method. It's a very linear, sequential, progressive project where we're just trying to we plan the work and then follow the plan, right? We saw plan the work the plan, or plan to execute the plan. This is a waterfall mentality, and it's all based on this concept that there is a perfect plan. And on many projects, that's true. However, in some situations, things change. Sometimes we need a different approach. I like to describe it as the cruise missile approach, right? The bullet approach doesn't work in certain scenarios, like where the sponsor tells you, let's get started on the stuff we know while we're trying to figure out the rest, right? Maybe there's time pressures. They got to hit those deadlines. So when there's all this fuzziness, too many things are unknown, you can't build a perfect plan. So what do? You get stuck sometimes in this planning phase. You keep trying to gather more requirements and you never want to actually start, right? These are projects where the target is fuzzy, and the more you gather requirements and do design doesn't necessarily make that target any clearer because there's just too many unknowns. So if the target's fuzzy, you're not going to want to build a plan and pull the trigger and start executing against that plan because the plan could be wrong. So instead, what do? You get stuck in this planning and replanning, hoping you get more info. Now, maybe in some circumstance, you think you got enough information to start, you pull the trigger, you start, start the project, you fire the bullet, but the bullet's just going to follow that aim. If that, goal was still kind of fuzzy, you might miss the bullseye. Right? We need a better approach than using bullets in that scenario. Another example, you might have a moving target. The scope is clear, but it keeps moving, it's shifting around. So your aim is always going to be off. You think you're aiming at the bullseye, but a split second later, the scope changes, things get redefined, the target moves, and now you're not aiming at the target anymore. And the more this happens, the more likely you're aiming in the wrong spot. If you pull the trigger, you're going to miss. It's a wasteful process. So we need something better than bullets for these situations where the scope is fuzzy or where it's clear but constantly changing, right? We need something better for those scenarios. And that's where these empirical processes come in, right? These empirical processes were designed to deal with these high change, high volatility, uncertain, ambiguous, these VUCA situations. And that's where we'll use a cruise missile. Now, there's a few differences between bullets and cruise missiles. One of the interesting ones is that you can steer a cruise missile in flight. That means if we have a fuzzy target, I'm not sure exactly of all the details, I might not want to pull a trigger on a bullet and shoot at it because I'm probably going to miss, but I could launch a cruise missile towards it in that general direction, because once I've launched the cruise missile, we can start proceeding towards the general direction of the target. As I get closer, the details will clarify and I can fine-tune the aim. I can fine-tune the plan so that I'm now pointing directly at my target. So this allows me to get started on the stuff we know while we're still figuring out the rest. We have enough information and we can launch this project knowing we're going roughly in the right direction. And as we get making progress on the things we do understand, the things that are still a little bit fuzzy, well, they'll clarify over time and we can adjust and fine tune to stay on track. That may be a lifesaver for your project. You'll actually be able to get started instead of being stuck in a rut. Also, for a bullet to take out a target, I pretty much got to hit the bullseye, but a cruise missile, it's just got to land somewhere nearby. The blast will take out the target anyway. So with the waterfall process, we're not just looking for the perfect plan, we're looking for perfect execution as well. We want that bullet to hit the bullseye. So all of our metrics and tracking and forecasting are all based on this concept of trying to achieve perfection. But the agile processes, well, they're quite a bit different. Agile processes aren't looking for perfection. They're looking for execution that's good enough. What does good enough mean? It means we need to understand the business case in a more nuanced way so that we understand enough to know whether we're on track or not, to know whether the project is falling within acceptable tolerances. Does the project have to be done on Thursday afternoon, 18 months from now? Or somewhere within that 2-week period is considered good enough, is considered on time? Is the budget have to be exactly $731,000? Or can it be somewhere between $750 is pretty much on budget? Is there some tolerance in the budget? And the same with scope. Do all the scope items have to get done? Or are there must-haves, should-haves, and nice-to-haves? Right? The thinking here is if we understand the business case at a more nuanced level, we can identify where there is some flexibility, where there's wiggle room, areas where the project can adapt to these changes, to the ambiguity, to the uncertainty. And that's where this cruise missile approach is quite interesting because it's designed that we can adjust as we go. A cruise missile, you don't have to spend enormous amounts of time up front gathering requirements and doing design. You just need some requirements in design. You need to know if you're roughly going in the right direction, but I don't need all the details. Those will emerge later. Similarly, we don't have to hit the bullseye. We just have to land somewhere nearby. So there's that concept that I don't need all the requirements of design up front, just some of them. I don't need a full detailed estimate and plan it down to the tiniest little detail because it's all probably going to be wrong. It just needs to be in the right ballpark, falling within acceptable ranges. So maybe a higher level estimate might be acceptable. We can get started on building stuff sooner, on making the changes sooner, because we need less upfront preparatory work. Another benefit of these other approaches, we call these cruise missile approaches empirical approaches, and Agile just happens to be an empirical approach. So already we can see that some projects are like bullets and some are like cruise missiles. Some need the waterfall method and some need the Agile method, right? We need capacity for both in our organization. And this is nothing particularly new. People have been talking about this for many years. In fact, the Gartner Group, it's an IT analysts firm, the Gartner Group, has been saying for years that an IT organization needs both approaches to be effective. They call it bimodal IT, right? An IT organization needs both waterfall and agile to execute successfully. Some projects might be more like a waterfall approach. It's well defined, very well understood, not a lot of ambiguity. We know what we're doing. We can estimate it pretty accurately. We can use a waterfall approach to execute those projects most successfully. But other projects are more like a cruise missile. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of VUCA situations, right? Ambiguity, uncertainty, volatility, a lot of change expected. We're going to have to adapt as we go. We're kind of get started on some stuff while we figure out the rest as we go. That's more of the cruise missile approach. So to be effective, you kind of need both. And this makes intuitive sense because if you think about these on a spectrum, the waterfall approach is at one end of the spectrum, the agile is at the opposite end of the spectrum. As a project appears, it's going to appear somewhere along that spectrum, and you're going to round it up or down to the nearest approach to manage it efficiently. So it might be closer to the waterfall end, you would manage it with a waterfall approach. If it's more to the other end of the scale, you would manage it with an agile approach, right? And that's why we see sometimes people even combine these two approaches to try and come up with some options that are more applicable somewhere in the middle that better align with the projects. So, but you need at least two of these. If I only had one method at one end of the scale, projects that appear near that end of the scale, I can manage them efficiently. But projects that appear way at the other end of the scale, well, that's a long way to round it up or down to the one method I do have. That would be a very inefficient approach. So Gartner says to be efficient, we need a good IT shop, we need two methods. We need a waterfall approach and we need an agile approach to adapt to both. But Gartner doesn't say it's just for software projects. They say for all of IT, which includes infrastructure as well, we need both approaches to have any chance of being efficient. So what kind of IT infrastructure projects do we find ourselves in where Agile might be applicable? Well, let's just take a look at three examples. I'm going to look at three common examples of IT infrastructure projects where Agile works. Now, I'm not saying these are the only examples. I'm just using these as three illustrations of three possible situations. There are others. I just wanted to give you some examples to get your thinking going. So the first is a situation where you're dealing with unknown or new technology, right? Say we're dealing with a new area that we've never dealt with before, right? We're using quantum computers. We've never done that before. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to install these things. I don't know how to set them up. I don't know what they need, right? A lot of unknowns. So we're going to expect there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty. There's going to be a lot of change as we go forward. So we're going to have to expect somehow that we're going to have to adapt. There's going to be a lot of changes in this scenario. This change is triggered by us not having the right skills, right? We don't understand this technology, or maybe we've chosen a vendor who has questionable skills, right? That might be the issue. It might be technology that has weak support. It's a brand new vendor, brand new technology. Maybe they don't have the support systems in place yet, not all the documentation's there. We could expect there's going to be a lot of challenges because answers are not clear. There may be a lot of mistakes being made. Or sometimes you're working on something that's just buggy, right? It's so new that it hasn't been fully tested and fully perfected yet. You're working with betas or early releases of a new technology. So anytime where there's unknown technology or new technology, you can expect there's going to be some uncertainty, some change, maybe some ambiguity. The estimates will probably be off. Maybe our systems design may have some mistakes in it because we based it on the stuff we do understand, thinking it might be similar, but maybe it's not. So that's one situation where you'll see that. And I can give you an example is, for example, network security monitoring systems. A lot of companies are now jumping into paying more attention to cybersecurity. So they're getting these security monitoring solutions in place in an area that's largely unknown to these organizations. They're not all cybersecurity experts, yet they're being forced to buy something more rigorous than just a simple firewall. Network monitoring tools, all kinds of active and passive defense systems. And this is getting beyond their technical abilities. It's pushing the limits. So now there's a lot of new technologies, unknown technologies that they're trying to deploy. And there's going to be lots of change and mistakes and uncertainty and volatility. This is the perfect scenario for using agile technologies. So that's one category of projects, right? Where you're going to see that there's uncertainty, there's new technology you've never worked with before. You know, for example, I worked with one organization and they were a Windows shop. Everything was Windows, right? So all Windows servers. And now all of a sudden they had to work with some new software that required Linux. It didn't work on Windows. It didn't run on Windows. It only ran in Unix environments. So now all of a sudden they had to start installing and creating Unix platforms way beyond their expertise and skill and lots of learning. Even if they took some courses, they were struggling because they just have a very rudimentary, very fundamental level of understanding of Unix, and they couldn't handle some of the more advanced applications. So again, lots of change and uncertainty and mistakes that they had to deal with. Okay, let me take another category. How about Agile will work on projects where we have changing requirements or configurations, right? Anytime where the business keeps changing their mind about what they want, right? Or configurations. I can give you an example of this. So I was working with one organization on an IVR, telephony solution. And in this particular scenario, the technology was fairly well understood. We could install the hardware, but there's all the configuration elements of this hardware, too many options, and the business couldn't make up their mind. They weren't sure what was built in or out of the box and what was custom, and they sort of had to learn as they go. They would give us their requirements, and we would configure the system like that, and then we'd have a discussion saying, you know, this one thing you asked us to do doesn't make a lot of sense, and they're like, why? And you explain. And they're like, oh, you can do that? It's like, yeah, it comes with that. Oh, I had no idea. Oh my God, well, we want that then. So let's change the design. And there was constantly revisions and changes to the configuration based on these evolving, changing requirements. Other parts of the business, once they heard that we were putting in this IVR system, they all started coming up with requirements too. Oh, well, for our business unit, could you do this? And hey, we would like it to do that instead. And all of a sudden, requirements were constantly shifting. So, you know, it's not necessarily a software development or even a systems integration kind of project, but there was a lot of configuration of these infrastructure elements. That's another scenario where there's requirements changing a lot, configurations changing a lot. That's an example where these agile methods, these empirical approaches, these cruise missile approaches, are far more efficient than the waterfall or bullet approaches. Let me be clear, you can manage any project with any process, but some of them are a better fit. Some of them are more natural, and Agile is a more natural fit. Remember what Gartner said, you need one methodology at each end of the spectrum to be efficient. If you had just waterfall, you could manage every project, but some of them are going to be very inefficiently managed. It's going to be a real struggle. That's why if you have both, you have waterfall and agile, you can be efficient. You can use the correct approach for the correct project. There's a third type of project that I'm going to discuss where agile may help, may make a difference for you. And that's projects where you're going to get some surprises during installation. You're expecting some surprises, right? You know, based on the past, maybe working with this client or in this building or with this technology, there's going to be surprises. Often this is with installations, right? Where you're running, for example, running cable through the roof, right? You're running it through the ceiling spaces, and you realize that every once in a while there's an unexpected, concrete barrier up there, a fire wall, a fire division, and the wires just won't cross over. Now you're going to have to get up there and bore holes and put in some fireproofing in there so that if there is a fire on one side of the wall, it won't travel along the cable and start a fire on the other side of the wall, right? So there's situations like that. I can give you a great example. I was doing some project work on one project that where they were upgrading an old facility and adding in some new technology and new equipment into an old facility. And they had some design documentation, but some of it was like 15 years old and completely out of date. They found out people weren't keeping all the documentation current on the as-built system. So in one situation, they went to open up a wiring cabinet, expecting to see 3 cables there joined together, and they open it up and they found a rat's nest of wiring and unlabeled wires. They had no idea what they were for, what they were doing. There was even some powered elements in the cabinet that they weren't expecting. They had no idea what they were dealing with, right? So surprises during installation, sure, it happens on every project. Waterfall projects can adapt less efficiently to those surprises than an agile project. So if you anticipate, because this facility is so poorly documented or past history is showing us that there's that the server room is a mess and there's a lot of cabling. I mean, you have a rat's nest of cables. There's no good cable management system in your server room, and it takes forever to trace things down and figure out what all the wires are doing and where they're going. If that's your world, then maybe an agile approach might be a little bit more applicable to help you adapt to those changes. Certainly not adapting to them using a waterfall approach, your estimates are probably going to be either way off, or you're going to have huge amounts of contingency added in to try and address all that uncertainty. And that may not be the most efficient approach. So it's another place where agile may make sense on your IT infrastructure projects. And I want you to think about this because there may be other examples from your world where you may find IT projects, infrastructure projects, benefiting from a project that's better able to adapt to volatility, uncertainty, change, and ambiguity. Other than these 3 scenarios, right? Unknown or new technologies, changing requirements or configurations, and surprises during installation, do you have any other ideas of where you're dealing with volatility and uncertainty? Sometimes it's not even the technology. You're dealing with team members who are unreliable and bad estimators, or vendors who don't know what they're talking about, or they lie, right? The vendor lie, the technology you bought doesn't work, right? So now you're going to have to make changes. You're going to have to adapt to those changes. I mean, shame on them for lying to you, but if you can expect that you're going to be in an environment where there's going to be some change happening or a lot of uncertainty, maybe agile is a better choice for those kinds of projects. There are some agile techniques, though, that can apply to any project, even a project that's generally using a waterfall method, right? A more stable project. There may be some agile techniques that you can benefit from. And I'm going to divide these into techniques that affect the structure or the processes you're going to follow during the project. And there'll be separate recommendations for things that affect the culture in the project environment. So I'm going to start with structure and process recommendations. These are techniques, agile techniques, that you can use on any IT infrastructure project that may affect the project structure or the processes you're going to follow. The first one is agile. In agile projects, there's a technique used where the team members get together on a daily basis to ask each other for help. What does that mean? They actually get together on a regular basis and they ask each other 3 questions. The first one of which is, did you have any problems getting your work done yesterday? If so, what are they? In other words, it's a formal, structured process whereby people can ask each other for help on a daily basis. right? So this is something you can do on waterfall projects. Get the team together, if not daily, how about a couple, 2-3 times a week? Don't wait for a weekly status meeting, because then somebody might have been sitting there all week with a simple problem that the person right next to them might have known the answer to, but they were too embarrassed to ask. So what happens is the project slows down, gets more, the performance slips. But if we can do this quickly, people have, if they have a problem, say you're doing this meeting every day, if people are having problems, you can ask them first thing the next morning, were there any problems getting your work done yesterday? And if there are issues, they can, that's a request for them to ask for help. What are they? Well, I didn't know how to modulate the XYZ thingamajiggy. Well, somebody else might say, hey, I did that on my last project. Let me stop by your desk afterwards and I'll tell you how to do it. Problem solved instantly, right? So it's a formal structured process whereby people can ask each other for help. Now, I said there were 3 questions in that meeting. The second one, right, is people coordinate their work on a daily basis. As a team, they're getting together and they say, hey, what are you working on today? And everybody shares what their priorities are for the day, because that might avoid problems in the first place. Somebody might say, oh, you're doing that? That might impact what I'm doing. How about we work together after this meeting to talk through the approach to make sure we're working in a consolidated fashion, so we don't butt heads, so we don't step on each other's toes. We don't have a problem. We can avoid the problem in the first place. And the third question in that is actually, are there any new risks? On a daily basis, I try to identify new risks and take action on them right away to avoid problems before they impact our work yesterday, right? So these 3 questions feed into each other on a cyclical basis. Every day we're doing this, we're getting feedback, we're adapting to it, we're helping each other out, we're avoiding problems. And if we're identifying new risks, we take corrective action to avoid them or mitigate the damage they can cause, trying to deal with those risks in advance before they become a project problem. There's some other structural stuff we can do. Another thing we could do is adjust our forecast based on the most recent performance data. On Agile projects, we call these Burndown Charts. What we do is we gather actual performance metrics, and we use those to update the forecast every day. So at the end of the day, we tell team members, email me how many hours are left on the stuff you were working on yesterday. Email it to me at the end of the day while it's still fresh on your mind. I can update that. I'll have a list of all the tasks and how many hours were estimated for each one. And if they update the hours remaining, the estimate to complete for each task, if we update those on a daily basis, I can take that total number, which is the total number of hours remaining, and I can plot it on a graph and see the burn down, how that slope of that line is going downwards, and to see if I project that line forward based on its most recent slope, its most recent angle. If I forecast that forward in time, I'll see, am I going to hit the end date on time or not, right? The x-axis on that graph being time, the y-axis being hours remaining. I can see, am I going to run out of time or not? That's important, right? That's a forecast. We can see, even if on a waterfall project, if we get people to update their hours remaining, look at that recent performance data, the trend of that line, I can see, are we going to finish the project on time or not? And it's a pretty accurate forecast, right? Looking at the average slope of that line compared to where we are today, and then forecasting that forward in time. What's the likelihood we're going to hit the project end date or not? That's another Agile technique you can put on any project. Another one is, again, remember, Agile is about value-focused delivery, right? Trying to deliver value. Are there any opportunities for early value on this project? Are there any, instead of doing a big bang release of everything, maybe there's some early proofs of concept or early pilots that might be useful. Even if you're going to roll out the solution all at once, maybe if we do a proof of concept early on, it can help business people get their head wrapped around what you're doing. Or maybe it'll allow you to reduce some risk early on, right? If there's 2 servers that need to talk to each other, 2 applications on 2 different servers on 2 different networks, for example, if I can at least in an early proof of concept get those 2 servers even talking to each other, that I can send a message from one and get a message back, even if the message is garbage, it's just a hello world type situation, right? from this server, I'll send a query that goes through the middleware, through the firewall, out to the other network, to the other server, grabs some random piece of data off the database and brings it all the way back and displays it on my screen. That might be a throwaway transaction, but at least by getting that done, I know I got the plumbing working, right? I know I've been able to successfully bridge the two networks. We've been able to get all the ports opened up correctly so that message can get through and the response can get back. Just by doing that, I know I've verified that some of the infrastructure is set up correctly. That might be useful. And if it doesn't work, then I know I need to try something else. It'd be nice to do a couple of these proofs of concepts until you have it working, until these two systems can talk to each other. Then you know you can proceed and just build out the rest of those systems, because you know it's just a matter of structuring the right messages. You've got the infrastructure figured out, right? Reduce that risk early on. What we don't want are late expensive failures, right? So the sooner we can find out if our approach is working or not, the better off, the lower risk, the safer, the more stable our project is. And there might be opportunities for early pilots. Maybe we need the whole system built to do the official launch, but maybe if we can do an early pilot with a couple of sample users, friendly users, maybe we can test out part of the solution and get some early understanding of how it's going to perform on its non-functional requirements, how it's going to scale, how it's going to handle volumes, how secure is it, etc. Maybe if we get part of the solution running, we can do some early pilots and get some valuable feedback from those pilots. Maybe if you're building out a system, you don't need the whole system in place to start capturing value. Maybe even just part of the solution up and running can be of benefit to other projects that might be able to leverage that or integrate into that and use that functioning piece to make their projects more successful. Maybe you don't have to wait till the whole solution is in place. So look for opportunities where we can have early pilots or early release of partial solutions, or maybe doing some proofs of concept to reduce risk, right? There's reasons for thinking of how we can break up the project, how we can chop it up and get some earlier reviews and approvals to sort of speed up the project overall. And we can also look at how we structure the projects to capture feedback earlier, right? Sometimes when you demonstrate a partially complete solution, people are going to get back to you and say, that's not what I meant. That's not what I needed. So why don't we figure out ways of getting that feedback sooner, right? Maybe there's modeling techniques where we can demonstrate what the final thing will look like, or maybe there's some early, as I said, early pilot or proof of concept that will allow us to get earlier feedback on whether the requirements are right or not, but also change requests as well. You may have built it right, but their needs have changed. I can give you a very quick example. I was doing some work for one of the major Canadian banks, and what they were trying to do was build an application to manage the treasury funds of the bank. So this is I guess the cash on hand of the bank at any particular given time. And what they had to do was figure out, based on these Basel regulations, right, from the Basel agreements, accords in Switzerland, looking at what is an appropriate amount of leverage for a bank to have, right, in the fractional reserve system. And what they figured out was, there's certain ratios, certain Basel ratios of what's an acceptable amount of cash for a bank to have on hand. And depending on the institution, their tolerance for risk and their regulatory level, which is different in different countries, a bank may be required to have, say, anywhere from 20 to even as low as maybe 10, 11% of their capital actually in the bank as cash, right? The rest could all be loaned out to people. So it's important for banks to report their capital position to their regulators on a regular basis, and these regulators will look at these numbers and determine the risk in that institution failing or continuing on. Now, this may be a foreign concept in some parts of the world, because in some countries, banks aren't allowed to leverage themselves at that level, and they have to have all of the cash that they say they have in the bank, and they use a completely different system, right? But in most countries, banks use this fractional reserve system, and much of their cash is actually loaned out, so they don't have a lot left over. And the regulators make sure they have enough so that if everybody goes to the bank and says, hey, I want to take some money to the bank, there's enough there to satisfy those requests. So what's happening in this system was the bank needed to replace their existing system. The existing system was very slow. it took too long to calculate the capital position of the bank. This had to be reported monthly. And as you could imagine, they had to look at every single transaction in the bank for the last 60 days to figure out what is the current capital position. Every debit card payment, every cash deposit, every check that was written, every Visa card charge, every Visa card payment, all of that stuff, mortgage payments, it all had to be taken into account to calculate the current capital position of the bank. So there were hundreds of millions of transactions to go through to do this calculation. And this was a very complex calculation, some rather complex formulas, and it took them 3 weeks to complete the full calculation. But this process often broke because there were new codes pulling out of all these different transactional systems to calculate the cash position. As you can imagine, there's new Visa card products being produced, new types of loans that pop up from time to time. So this calculation would break regularly because of new products being created in the bank and codes that the system didn't know how to interpret. So if it takes 3 weeks to execute this calculation and it breaks 2 weeks in because there's a new code, they'd have to restart the process all over again to change their code and then re-execute, and it would now take them 3 weeks again, starting from scratch. Well, the whole thing then would take 5 weeks, but they had to report every 4 weeks or pay a fine to the government. So this bank found themselves paying a fine many months of the year, and the fines added up to millions of dollars. So the bank said, this doesn't make sense. Why don't we come up with a new system that can execute faster? So they looked at alternate technology, and they realized that one of the things that they would have to do when they did an early pilot was that they did an early proof of concept to figure out risk. They figured out that new technology, while the technology itself could perform at the speeds that they wanted to, they were hampered by their data warehouse on the back end used the wrong technology that was not really efficient for this new approach. This new tool that they were using wasn't well suited to that back-end data mart. So instead, they actually created a new back-end data system, a different product set. And again, they did this through a new proof of concept. They changed the technology back-end and did a new proof of concept and found that it was blazingly fast. In combination with the new tool, instead of taking 3 weeks, it would be done in less than a day. They could run it overnight and have the answer by the next morning, which is great news for them, because if it breaks, they could rerun it many times during during that 4-week period until they get it working. Right? If there's errors, they can clean it up and run it again. So in that case, it was this early proof of concept that identified the back-end proposed technology didn't work. They were able to swap it out with an alternate technology and run the test again with another proof of concept, and then they did see that it did work and it scaled. So this is another example where getting early feedback or changes will help you build the better solution. You may have to change your technology based on those early feedbacks, but look for ways of structuring your project to do that. So those are some of the structure or process changes that we might see, right? I also want to look at cultural changes, right? And that we can adopt from Agile into our regular projects, right? One of them is this concept of openness and transparency. We need more openness and transparency on our teams to make sure that we are sharing all the latest information. We're able to ask for help if we're getting in trouble. This drives tremendous efficiencies. Remember those first 3 questions, right? Asking for help on a daily basis, right? Coordinating with others on a daily basis. This only works if we're open about what we're doing and where we're having challenges and transparent with our needs. Then we can help each other and get highly efficient on any kind of project. And similarly, learn how to commit as a team and encourage team level problem solving, right? It's not individuals taking on little pieces of work, right? It's individuals doing it on behalf of the team, and the whole team commits. So what happens is we're not measuring that some individuals are successful on the team and others fail. The whole team fails if they haven't got all the work done. So if somebody's having a problem, that encourages knowledge transfer, mentoring, collaboration, right? There's going to be far more team building and efficiency on the project if they help each other out at the point of need. Builds capacity and drives great cultural benefits for the organization. And that can happen on any IT infrastructure project. So what are some general takeaways that you can take from this that, for all of your future projects? What are some of the things that we can look at? Well, let's first of all, Agile isn't just for software development projects, right? It works on infrastructure projects as well. And on IT infrastructure projects, right, some can go full Agile, some can use the full Agile approach. And I gave you 3 examples, right? Projects where the requirements are fuzzy, projects where you're expecting lots of change, et cetera, right? Projects where you're using brand new technologies or technologies where we don't have a lot of skills. I talked about that as well. And so on, right? So there's some IT projects where you can go full Agile, other ones where you can use some Agile techniques. Even on a waterfall project, you might be able to adopt some of these Agile structural changes, process changes, or some of these cultural changes to get more efficiency. The decision of whether we should use Agile and what Agile techniques should be done on a project by project basis. Don't say all our projects will be non-Agile or all our projects will be Agile, because it gets much more granular than that. Remember, the decision is based upon, are we working in a VUCA scenario? Is this project having to deal with volatility, uncertainty, change, and ambiguity? If the answer is yes, then maybe you want to start bringing in some Agile practices and make it a full Agile project. If the answers to most of those are no, then you might want a waterfall project, but some of those Agile techniques could be added to the waterfall project to make it slightly more efficient if you think it'll help. Also remember, all PMs should understand basic Agile principles and techniques. Even PMI, the Project Management Regulatory Body, or creating international standards, says that Agile is so important that all PMs need to know Agile. So that kind of covers my topic of the use of Agile on IT infrastructure projects. At this point, I'll open up to questions. We have a number of people on the line. If you have a question, you can type it in the questions window on your web interface or in the chat window. If you'd like, you can click your raised hand icon and I'll unmute your line and you can ask your question verbally if you'd like, although I do remind you that this is being recorded, so your voice will be included in the recording. Okay, I see one hand up from Mohammed. Mohammed, I've unmuted your line. You can self-unmute. You have your own control on your web interface. Just self-unmute and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, hello. So Kevin, one question I have is how to promote more the Agile approach. Is it more the owner side? Is it having better teams, equip our teams better with Agile tools and frameworks?
Okay, let me answer that. So really is 3 things you need to look at. The first is the team ready to go Agile? Do they have training? Are they willing to work in an environment of ambiguity, right? So some of it is, do they have the right training? Do they have right tools and supports to go Agile? Do they have the let's call it the cultural tolerance of working in an Agile way? And I'll give you a quick example. Some cultures, and I don't just mean team cultures, I mean even at the larger scale, the social ethnic cultures in society. Some cultures are more tolerant of Agile ways of working than others. It's not about capability, right? Everybody's capable of using Agile or not Agile, that's fine. But some cultures are more more adaptable to the Agile way of working. I'll give you one example. So there was a study done that says Southern European cultures, so France, so Spain, Portugal, Italy, Southern Europe, Greece, Southern European cultures tend to be more relationship-based than process-based. So their attitude when they face volatility and uncertainty is to say, hey, that's okay, we'll get together, we'll talk about it, we'll figure it out. Between all of us, we'll find an approach that works, right? I'm sure we have the expertise, we'll figure it out. And they're very comfortable working with that, with ambiguity, knowing that the people can sort out the problem somehow. They'll figure out a way. Whereas Northern European cultures, like Germany, Netherlands, etc., Belgium, right? Northern European cultures, Poland, tend to be more process-based than relationship-based. What does that mean? It means they feel very uncomfortable in an environment of uncertainty, because what they're looking for is a stable process. They want things to be all thought through and planned out in advance. And if everybody follows the plan, it should go well. So again, if you're in that kind of cultural environment, the team could do Agile, but they're going to feel more uncomfortable doing Agile because that's not their preferred style of working. So you have to look at things like the culture of the team, their level of training. Is the team ready to go Agile? Then you have to look at the sponsor. Does the sponsor understand how their role changes on an Agile project? Are they willing to support the team through this Agile process? Are they willing to tolerate some ambiguity, some change, some flexibility in the business case, right? Are they allowing some tolerance levels in terms of budget or timelines or scope? Are they creating that ability for the team to adapt, some room within which they can adapt? Right, so we got to look at the sponsor, and then you have to look at the actual business, right? That they're working within. Are the business processes, the governance in place to allow an Agile project to succeed in that organization? So there's a few things you have to look at. If you're trying to promote Agile in an organization, I usually prefer going from the top down, trying to convince the executives this is the right thing, and then working your way down through the organization to get Agile rolled out. You could certainly start grassroots with a specific team, but they're going to be hitting barriers all the time as governance functions and project auditors and others come in and try to stop what they're doing because it's not following the official process. But if you start at the top down, it's quick for executives to see the benefits, and then they can get everybody else to get on board, to line up with this new initiative. You'll get more support, and you'll be far more successful with your Agile rollout. Okay, thank you. I have a question from Prem Kumar. I've unmuted you. You can unmute yourself and make a comment. Sure, go ahead.
Hey, hi, Kevin. I'm having a question that I'm already working as a project manager and I'm working with the Agile methodology. But here I'm having a question that how we can define a deadline in an Agile project, as like it is an ongoing process. So can we set a deadline in that, and how?
Sure. So Agile is what I'm referring to, there's Agile. There's Agile practices for operations, ongoing operations, where there is no project. It's just we're doing the same process over and over again. So there's Agile operations practices, largely adapted from lean process management. But there's also Agile project management practices that are separate. And if you recall, the definition of a project is that there's a specific start date and end date, right? This is a specific time-bound initiative. So Agile project management practices have definite plans for the project start date and the project end date, and there's metrics and tracking and forecasting to keep you within those timelines. So if you haven't learned those techniques, for example, Scrum, right? Scrum is one of the Agile methodologies. Scrum is actually it combines some operational techniques, but it's more of an execution phase initiative. It doesn't cover the full project lifecycle. Scrum doesn't talk about upfront estimating and planning and requirements gathering and design. That's all not part of Scrum. In fact, Scrum calls that phase 0 or sprint 0. That's the stuff that happens before Scrum. And then you go through Scrum to build stuff, but it doesn't tell you what you should build. That all comes from sprint 0, right? That's the upfront gathering requirements, doing design, estimating, planning. That's all pre-Scrum stuff, but that's really important to the Scrum project. So Scrum takes on after that. Once we've defined scope, we've assigned the team, then Scrum starts building all that stuff. And then when you're done building it and you're ready to deploy it or launch it, get it out into the world, Scrum provides no guidance for that either. That's not part of Scrum. That's part of other Agile methods. So some like extreme programming or feature-driven development cover some of the planning phase plus the execution phase, but there are some methodologies that cover the full life cycle, like disciplined Agile delivery, DAD, or SAFe, the Scaled Agile Framework for Enterprises, right? Or the Agile PM approach, right? There's a number of Agile methodologies that cover the full life cycle, and those give you a more full end-to-end view of how to do Agile project management. So if all you know is Scrum, you could be missing out on some of that really important information. How do I estimate in Agile? How do I build a plan in Agile? When is the project going to be done? What metrics do I report to my business on progress That's not part of Scrum, that's outside of Scrum.
That's good. Thank you.
Good, thank you. There's a question here from Sasitara. Sasitara asked, are Agile and CMMI compatible? Absolutely, yes, absolutely. Great question too. Yeah, so CMMI defines a whole bunch of structured processes around, let's call it, CMMI specifically is about maturity in your, say, software development processes, for example, is how it's most commonly applied. CMMI stands for Capability Maturity Model Integrated, right? So it's the old software CMM. It was updated to be called CMMI, and that's what Sasitara is referring to. So this CMMI model defines, it says you have to define your processes in detail, follow the processes, gather metrics about the process along the way, how you're doing, and then use those metrics from an auditing perspective to figure out how you can improve the process for the future. So it goes through a series of levels, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so CMMI defines that framework. It was created by Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute. And CMMI very much is compatible with Agile, but remember the full Agile lifecycle. Remember, Scrum only addresses the execution phase, right? The do phase, the build phase, right? The implement, the change phase. That's the part that actually is addressed by Scrum if that's your Agile approach. There's all that upfront estimating and planning, which is important, and there are Agile methods that address that, but they're not part of Scrum. And there are Agile methods about deployment and rollout that are important as well. And if you're doing CMMI, CMMI should be a disciplined, structured approach to Agile, like SAFe or DAD or Agile PM or DSDM or Open Unified Process. There's a number of them. Does cover the full end-to-end life cycle and is fully compatible with CMMI. But remember, CMMI also addresses a few things that are not project related. So CMMI also includes things like organizational capabilities, about development of your staff, developing their skills for future projects. That's obviously outside the scope of a project, but that is something that needs to be done at the organizational level. But yes, Agile can live beautifully within a CMMI environment. And I've got slides and presentations and stuff on that as well. Okay, so Sasitara said, thank you for the answer. That's great, thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Just click your raised hand icon or type it in the question window. We're quickly approaching the end of the presentation. I've got time for one more question. This is your last chance. By the way, if you need professional development credits, you can claim 1 hour of professional development credit for this course. If you're, for example, a PMI certified project manager, so a PMP or a CAPM or a PGMP, you know, that kind of thing, you can declare 1 PDU for this. If you're an IIBA certified business analyst professional, you can claim 1 CEU. If you are a American Society for Quality ASQ certified software quality engineer, you can claim 1 recertification credit for this. Many different groups offer this. DAMA certified data architects, data management professionals, you can claim 1 recertification credit. So if you think you need credits for this, you should be able to claim it for most IT professions. No more questions? Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. This is one in a series. We do these webinars roughly every 2 weeks on various topics. Wherever you found out about this one, keep your eyes open for the next one. This session has been recorded and will be posted up on YouTube within usually within 2 or 3 days. And I look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye for now.